National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Parrott, and historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And our special guests for today's episode are Adam Foreman, student programs specialist here at the museum.
Oh, hey, Seth.
No problem. Chrissy Gregg, assistant director of distance learning.
Hello, hello.
And Dr. Alexandra Richie, professor of history and author.
Hi.
Today we'll be discussing the 2008 film Valkyrie. Valkyrie focuses on the July 20th, 1944 plot to kill Adolf Hitler, a plan carried out by one German colonel, Claus von Stauffenberg, at Hitler's seemingly impregnable Eastern Front headquarters in East Prussia in what is today Poland. The film then follows the chaotic events that followed the attempt on Hitler's life and showcase the role of von Stauffenberg, who is today considered one of Germany's national heroes. Valkyrie stars Tom Cruise as Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, Kenneth Branagh as General von Treschkow, Bill Nighy as General Ulbricht, Terence Stamp as General Beck, and many others. The film was directed by Brian Singer, produced by Christopher McQuarrie, Brian Singer, and Gilbert Adler. Valkyrie was a modest critical success and a financial success. So with that, and I'm going to start with you, Chrissy, because you're one of our veterans here.
Oh.
In your opinion, how accurate is Valkyrie?
I think it's in some ways accurate enough. I was surprised at some of when I was fact-checking some of the things I think they got right, but I also think it's hard to determine in some ways how accurate this film is because there's so many conflicting accounts. Many of the people who were involved were obviously killed later. So it seems like when I was fact-checking and I was like, oh, that's correct, and then I would read it somewhere else, I was like, oh, well, no, maybe that's not, because it's so many different tellings of the story from so many different eyewitnesses, participants, and then people who weren't there, or they were interrogated under duress, like by the Gestapo. So I guess it's accurate enough for me to be satisfied in this setting to say that.
How about you, Adam?
That really changes my answer. I hadn't considered the interrogation under duress thing. That's a really interesting concept. Before Chrissy just said that, I would have said this was shockingly accurate. I thought that the telling of this story, even some of the finer details of his work in North Africa, him being sent to North Africa because of things he was saying in Poland, I think a lot of that is shockingly accurate. But I had not considered the idea of a lot of these accounts that we're reading are actually made under duress. So, yeah, but I'm sticking with the shockingly accurate part.
What about you, Alex?
I think more or less it's accurate. I think there's some details which are not, which were done because you've got to Hollywoodize a film and make it run and make it work. And there's some very obvious examples of that. But generally speaking, the story is pretty good. Stauffenberg was a very interesting character. He started off as quite a convicted Nazi. He worked willingly in Poland, saw some of the atrocities or heard of some of the atrocities, started to change his mind, and then by the time he started to get involved with the conspiracy, he had completely changed and decided that he was going to go against Hitler. So this story, the big picture from outer space is absolutely right. When you get down to details like which who put the bomb in the cognac bottles on the plane, did Van Heften stand in front of him when he was being shot? These sorts of details, no, there are some Hollywoodizations which aren't correct. But I think generally speaking, the overall plot is pretty good.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's impossible to know exactly what was said in some of these conversations, these behind literally closed-door conversations, because there's no transcript of it. And like you said, Chrissy, most of the people that took part in those conversations were executed or were killed later by various circumstances. But I think as far as the overall events that occurred that led up to the July 20th plot and then the actual July 20th, 1944 attempt on Hitler's life and then the follow-up, I think it's pretty dang accurate, really. I think it's really good, and it hits a lot of the high points. And I think it does a really good job. And it's a story that's pretty well known. And, I know we'll get to this later, but, there is a certain amount of excitement in the movie, even though you know how it's going to end, what happens. So it's pretty interesting. Alex, do you think it correctly follows von Stauffenberg's wartime service? I know it leaves a lot out, and you just kind of briefly touched on it just now, but what do you think?
It has to leave a lot out because it's, as you said, it's very exciting. It's a very exciting film, and if you started to really go into the depths of this character, you'd have a 10-hour movie, and it wouldn't be any good. But yeah, the basic story is that there's a guy who's basically a kind of decent guy. He gets caught up in the Nazi whole thing. He goes into Poland, and then as he realizes how bad and how criminal the regime is, he changes his mind. And this is something that's a very great redeeming feature of him. And we all of us have to understand, I know much more about the sort of resistance in Poland or in Lithuania or in Belarus or in these places. But to be a resistor in Germany was so much different because you're going against your own population, your own people, where, some 70%, 80%, if not more of the population were ardent pro-Hitler or at least going along with the regime.
Yeah.
And to actually stand up against those people, your own population, and effectively put yourself forward as being a traitor as opposed to a heroic resistance fighter in Poland or in France, then you face a completely different set of moral and political and sociological and psychological circumstances that are so much more complex. And so one can only, take your cap off to these guys who actually did put themselves forward and in the end risk their lives and give their lives for this event.
What about you, Adam? What do you think?
So it does leave out a lot. He joins the army in 1926 whenever he's 19. So he's one of those career military officers, and the film really doesn't do that justice, other than saying that he's extraordinarily loyal to the army and not necessarily the government that he's fighting for. So it doesn't really build up that suspense of this being a career army officer fundamentally participating in treason, which is a big, big deal. So he joins the army at 19 in 1926. He's with the 6th Panzer Division in France and in Luxembourg. He goes to Poland. He sees what the Einsatzgruppen are doing in Poland, and on that front of the war. He starts speaking out against it, and he gets sent to North Africa. And that's where the film kind of picks up. So there's a whole 20 years of his military history that's completely left out and just really doesn't build a great backstory for why it's so important that this is a group of officers who are committing treason. This is not just a random civilian on the street trying to throw a bomb at, Hitler's car, right? This is a group of very loyal, very long-term officers that are plotting against the government, and I just think that it really misses that key, that the film does really misses that key point in building that backstory.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, von Stauffenberg, like you said, he was an aristocrat. He came from an aristocratic family.
Very old, noble family. Yeah, very old family.
They had castles, did they not? Like numerous castles throughout the country. And he was exorbitantly wealthy. And, he came from, as I said, an aristocratic family, and he was entrenched in that German. I mean, he wasn't Prussian, was he? No, he wasn't. Was he?
Yeah, they were an old family. I wouldn't say they were extraordinarily wealthy. They belonged to effectively the Junker class, which was characterized by its sort of code of honor, of officer class, and so on. And in fact, characteristically, were not particularly wealthy, but were defined by their familial ties and by their ancient ties from the Teutonic Knights up to the 1870 war and 1914 and so on. So very, very conflicted because of the code of honor that went back to this old Junker class idea. And this, of course, came head to head with Hitler and his new ideas about the Wehrmacht. And that's one of the things, so one of the inaccuracies in the film, for example, is that the Wehrmacht refused to adopt the Hitler salute until after the 20th of July plot. So, of course, that's an inaccuracy in the film. But there was a sense in at least a certain number of the officer class in the Wehrmacht that they weren't going to adopt to this Nazi ideology. So there was always conflict, and he was a member of that old Junker aristocratic Prussian officer class that didn't necessarily take the Austrian corporal to heart, even from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think it's not coincidentally that the movie, the first, I guess you could call it a scene, is the oath to Hitler.
Yes.
You hear them in the background, and
Right.
they're putting it on screen, the text on screen right there, because that's at the heart really is what most of these officers are having. If they have any qualms aside from being put in front of a firing squad,
there's
it's
so many
breaking their oath.
Wehrmacht guys I've interviewed over the years that always point to the oath as being the sort of crucial thing. But the interesting thing is that they also swore an oath to the Weimar Republic, which they're very happy to break at any moment. So it's like, well, okay, that's very important, but how really important was this oath? It's something that historians have been grappling with for many years.
Good point. Did von Stauffenberg actually have a meeting with Hitler to alter the Valkyrie plans? I have done a fair amount of reading here in the last few days to answer that question, and I see you shaking your head, Alex. Lay it on us.
No, he didn't actually meet Hitler. That again, that was a scene that was put in to increase the Hollywood tension, if you will. But I mean, sometimes one can be too critical as well of a film like this. I think that there are times when you're making a movie like this that has to be over in a couple of hours. You have to put in things that increase the tension. And what's more amazing than seeing Hitler meeting this guy on celluloid? So one forgives these sort of minor infractions of historical accuracy in the service of making the film really work.
One thing I was thinking when that scene came through is he's in the Berghof, He's in the Viper's Nest, if you will, and he's surrounded by all of the high-ranking. Yeah, Speer's there, Himmler's there, Goebbels is there, Goering is in that room. So if he was going to whack anybody, that would have been the day to do it,
And it was a really interesting scene because you're right, everyone was in there, and none of them scoffed at him walking in the door. None of them in the room had a negative reaction to him walking in. So in that moment, you really start to feel like he's actually a part of that group, which kind of makes it just heightens that drama between, he's going to betray these people that are almost accepting him into a space where it's just the very high leadership in that room. And it was also really shocking how humble he was to Hitler himself, which, complete sidebar, I would really love to see the Hitler from Downfall played in this movie, because that would have been really cool. But that's a complete sidebar there.
I don't know. I actually took a total opposite reaction to that scene. I was like, that was like my point in there, because I was frustrated by the scene, because like, let's put in every trope about Hitler. Here he is, he's petting his German shepherd. He like quotes Wagner. It's like, and they're the Berghof. I don't know, just like, this is so stupid.
Well,
because I mean, it's after D-Day, this like symbolism and then it never happens. I probably am being a little too critical in some ways.
I get you. I mean, it was fake, and it didn't happen. And another minor detail is that the only time he would have absolutely had to give the Hitler salute was when he was walking in to see Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and you wouldn't have gotten away without doing that in that particular moment. But no, as a historian, I'm always irritated by fake scenes, and that irritates me. But again, if you're going to make a Hollywood film that's on a budget, and you've got to make the thing flow through, you got to forgive some of these things, and that was just a sort of way of encapsulating, as you say, the Hitler German Shepherd Blondie, all that stuff.
It's a beautiful dog, by the way.
Yeah, a beautiful dog, and we get the point that's moving the thing along, and Hitler is sort of tensely signing in on this, but it never happened.
So one other thing I really want to bring up is in that same scene, and Seth, you may be the best person to answer this, in that same scene, Hitler's very dismissive of the Allied invasion. How accurate is that? Because I don't know what Hitler's actual reaction to the invasion would have been.
Well, I mean, the thing was, and anybody, feel free to jump in here. I mean, the thing was is that the initial invasion in Normandy on the 6th of June was thought by Hitler to be not a ruse, but
a decoy,
a decoy,
right?
Yeah, a secondary invasion, because he still believed, you have the 15th Army in reserve and near the Pas-de-Calais, and that's where he thought he was convinced that the main invasion was coming from. So I mean, how dismissive was he on June 7th? I don't know, But I mean, we were there. There was no arguing the fact that Allied troops had landed in Western Europe.
The whole thing was hilarious because first of all, Rommel has just gone off to have a holiday with his wife instead of hanging out, watching them. Hitler's adjutant refuses to wake him up because he's, got to get his beauty sleep, so he's only woken up after midday, and then just says, "Oh yeah, it's nothing," doesn't take anything seriously for quite a long time. So yeah, you're right. He just doesn't get what's going on.
It was well over a week before he was like,
really
okay,
clicked,
this is probably something pretty serious, which whatever. Again,
which is a good thing, thank goodness.
Yeah, really.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, not to get a conversation about D-Day, but I mean, the forces were there. The German forces were there that theoretically could have repelled at least a part of the invasion force because the beachheads were not 100% secure. But anyhow, getting back on topic.
It's hard not to talk about D-Day here, right?
Right.
We were talking about how von Stauffenberg in the movie meets Hitler for the first time there at the Berghof. How accurately does the film show the difficulty or not to actually get to Hitler in terms of the German officer corps? And he was pretty high up. He was chief of staff of the reserve army at this time, I believe. Von Stauffenberg was.
Right.
So, I mean, how accurate would it have been for him to get to Hitler that quickly and that easily? Can anybody? I don't know. So can anybody,
Well, Hitler was very hard to get to. He was paranoid, completely paranoid, and he was convinced that people were out to get him, which they were. I mean, there were many attempts on his life, even before, the general's plot before Czechoslovakia, which was stymied by the peace in our time Czechoslovakian agreement, and many other people like Hans Elsner who set a bomb out in the beer hall in Munich.
Bürgerbräu killer, yeah.
And various other plots against him, and then there were resistance groups like the Weiße Rose and the Red Orchestra and many other things. And in fact, Hitler was very concerned about this. He was furious, for example, to learn about the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, because of course he got the great honor burial and everything else, but he was like, Reinhard, I told you, don't take the same route and have an open-top Mercedes driving through Prague. Are you crazy? He was furious that he'd gotten himself killed, in fact. And Hitler was very paranoid. Now, of course, once the war starts, he spends most of the war in the Wolfschanze. Wolfschanze is so well protected that it's very, very difficult to get anywhere near him. And this is the whole point about and that's what the movie does extremely well, aside from things like uniforms and all that, which is fabulous. Also this sense of how do you get in to get close to Hitler. And he spends over 800 days of World War II in the Wolfschanze. And you can't just walk in.
Well,
can't get anywhere near.
Yeah, that was the strongest scene, or one of the strongest scenes I thought for me of the layers of security around the Wolfschanze. It was like, as you see them driving past, you see this one layer of, guards, and then you drive further, and another layer, The visuals of that scene were very striking to me. I thought,
right, even the soldiers in the trench with the machine guns pointing outward.
Yeah.
I mean,
and inward.
Yeah,
if you noticed,
right?
They were both ways.
So I thought that scene was really well done. And I was curious, so I counted it up. The film says that there were 15 attempts on Hitler's life. I ended up going back and counting. There were more like 22 or more than that, and some dating all the way back to his time in the very early days of the party.
like the
20s, 1928, I think, was the first one that I found. So where people tried to poison him at dinner. So it was, of course he was paranoid. He has, I think, good right to be paranoid.
Right to be.
Well, and you see how the steps that they took to make sure that nothing was going to happen to him. So, for example, when he does his big parade in Warsaw, the Victory Parade, once Warsaw has capitulated, all Poles are cleared out of their apartments, aligning the route of the Victory Parade. And then they change the route, and all those people are kicked out too, and there were Poles who were trying to assassinate him, but they didn't have a chance. There were Germans on the rooftops and everything else. Not a single person, as you see in the footage, on the streets, unlike in some of the places with like Sudetenland or in Austria when he goes in and everybody's on the streets. There's nobody, because they're not allowed to go anywhere near because of the fear of an assassination attempt of some kind. And this is the same, he becomes very aware. So you talk about people trying to poison his food. So in the Wolfschanze, he has young girls brought in from the village who have to taste his food every meal.
Wow.
And if they die, well, so what? Because you're saving the Führer, right? So that's, the paranoia was justified in a way.
Do you feel that the movie gives the average viewer a good sense of the conspirators' motivations? I think, I'm going to answer this one before you guys do. I think it does for von Stauffenberg. I think it, obviously Tom Cruise is the main, he's the guy in this movie. And he goes on several rants and dissertations throughout this film where he gives his reasons why. I mean, it starts when he's writing in his journal, or theoretically writing in his journal and narrating it to you. But I think it gives him, his character, you get a pretty good idea of why he's doing what he's doing. But for the other guys, I don't get the impression that the film gave that away. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I would agree with that as well. I think that, for me personally, is the weakest point in the movie, and why in some ways at the end I don't feel as emotionally invested as I wish I did. And it's because it's like I don't, other than for when von Stauffenberg gets shot, sorry to spoilers, that everybody else I didn't really feel all that much. And I think it's because I don't know their motivation to be there in the first place. And so I would say that's kind of my personal biggest critique of the movie. I guess I should have saved that for the end. But
what do you think, Adam?
I think you're right in that, but I think the movie does it on purpose. So the film very purposely sets it up to where von Stauffenberg is joining a resistance that's already very well established. They made him chief of staff of the Home Army specifically to get access to Hitler. The resistance did, so the high-level ranking resistance officers. So I think it leaves the viewer in the same position that von Stauffenberg was in that he knows his own reasons that he's joining the resistance. However, they may not necessarily line up with the others, but the goal remains the same. So the resistance group or resistance cell or whatever we're calling them, the resistance people that he joined, really had been working for a while to eliminate Hitler. The thing that really frustrated me in the film is how they really glossed over the treatment of Jewish people and how it made it seem like von Stauffenberg was innocent per se in what was happening, because he actually agreed with the segregation of Jews in society. He didn't necessarily agree with their extermination or with the Kristallnacht or with the violent campaign that happens, but he wasn't exactly innocent of it either. And the way that very first, whenever the film opens, the way that very first scene, and he's writing his journal, he says, in the way that they're treating the Jews, he's not exactly innocent in that, and they don't really.
Well, I think he hit the nail on the head and said he was against the annihilation of the Jews. And I mean, Alex, you can please jump in, but I think that he was, as you said, Adam, he's not completely innocent in terms of his ideals or ideological beliefs, whatever you want to say, but because he was, he did serve the Third Reich, willingly as a soldier.
Even though he was really disillusioned with it, he still served them.
Well, about halfway through his career, he was. I'd say halfway through the war for him, he became disillusioned. In 1939 and 40, he was not disillusioned at all, I don't believe. But what do you think?
I think that's one of the really interesting questions about resistance. How do you separate out people like Helmut von Moltke, the von Trotz-Husolds, and some of the others who from the very, very beginning were trying to, they had jobs in the Foreign Office, but they were trying to communicate with the Astors and the others in Churchill in the UK, trying to say, yes, there are people who really do resist Hitler right from the very beginning. They were against him and the whole regime. And then you've got that whole group like the people who were around Stauffenberg who realized that Hitler was losing the war. And it's very difficult to tease the motivation out from whether or not it was really about trying to save Germany and save Germany from the sort of defeat that was coming, because anybody with two eyes in their head could see by 1944 that Germany was going to lose the war, or so in other words, was it in a sense motivated by last-minute worries about Germany's fate, or was it really motivated by a deep conviction that Hitler was wrong and the absolutely despicable human being standing for a despicable system? So even the word resistance has many, many facets, and there were very different groups and very different individuals who stood against Hitler for very different motivations. And Stauffenberg is, I think, one of the more murky ones. Although, again, he put his life on the line to kill this man, and realize that he was going to be called a traitor, whatever happened, which he was. And he and his family were besmirched in Germany when the plot was revealed, and of course it was revealed that Hitler had survived. There was a spike in support for Hitler, and people saying, thank goodness our Führer has survived this terrible calamity. So, he realized that he was putting his and his family's life at risk, and for that one has to have a great deal of respect, whatever the ultimate motivation was.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that's arguable. I mean, the man, died for what he believed in, whatever, as you said, whatever those beliefs may have been. He put it on the line when a lot of other people were too cowardly to do so. And that absolutely bears quite a bit of respect, or retains a lot of respect. But I did my fair amount of research before this, and there's not, because obviously he was executed, and there's only a couple of people who survived the war who knew him, and it's you don't really get a very good representation of what he wanted to do or why, and I think I mean, as you said, it ultimately he gave his life to try and end this, but you always got to kind of wonder what were his plans, which leads me to my next talking point: is what were the plans for a post-Hitler German government? What was the movie talks about it a little bit. It says it was going to be an army-run state, and they were going to again, they're trying to sue for peace with the Western Allies, but it didn't say anything about the Soviet Union. And von Stauffenberg was he wanted to keep some of the 1939 borders that Germany had acquired, for the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia and places like that. But what were the plans? What were the ultimate plans for post-Hitler von Stauffenberg's boys in charge Germany?
So I did a little bit of reading on that, and I found really conflicting kind of accounts as far as what their plan actually was. I think the consensus is that it would have been not necessarily a military dictatorship, but it would have certainly been a military-led oligarchy with a very small ruling class, without a truly elected government.
At least at that point.
However, the film sort of contradicts that whenever the retired general is talking about his plans to put this one politician in power and the army supporting that one politician. So the film sort of contradicts that. But I'm not convinced that there is a real consensus in what the plan actually was.
I would say too. I mean, the sense that I get is that much of the general leadership, other than maybe a couple of them, were pretty conservative in their political viewpoints, and as you maybe mentioned, Seth, kind of returning back to and Adam as well, something obviously like pre Weimar, obviously. So there wasn't necessarily support on the extreme kind of left side of that, and then that body was more conservative in terms of in their viewpoints and the larger resistance movement. I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but
so I think we can all agree they certainly weren't going to return to republic. That I don't think ever was a goal. And I even read an account that said that this new government, whatever it would be, had plans to actually ally with the United Kingdom and the United States to fight the Soviet Union in the very next war. So to actually push the Soviet Union back to its pre-World War II borders. So it's so I don't know.
Yeah, again, it depends very much on who you're talking about. So if you're talking about the Kreis and the von Moltke group, they were talking about the creation of a Germany which was based on very much the United Kingdom model of a parliamentary democracy and so on. And he was involved with Stauffenberg. They all knew each other, and they met in secret and so on. And Kreis is a very interesting resistance group in and of itself. But Stauffenberg, you're right, he was much more conservative. He was part of that Prussian aristocratic, army elite who believed that Germany should go back to something like the 19th century Bismarckian idea of Germany. My personal view is that they had absolutely no chance of succeeding anyway. I think that even if they managed to assassinate Hitler and Valkyrie had been called out, it was a small group of guys in Berlin and of course Paris, but generally speaking, as I said, there was a spike in popularity of Hitler. I don't think that Goebbels, Goering, and Himmler and the rest of them would have allowed a small group of conspirators to usurp their incredibly sophisticated, controlling, clause on power. So my view is I think it was doomed from the beginning. Interestingly enough as well, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin were very dismissive of this plot because they had all been intent on unconditional surrender. They wanted to wipe Germany off the map. None of this stab in the back theories and so on. And in a way, a plot like this was in fact counterproductive to their war aims. And so they really faced a kind of negative attitude from all sides, both from the German people from within, but also from the Allies from without.
Yeah, I agree, and there's something you got to think too. If it was von Stauffenberg's group, they wanted to make peace with the Western Allies and retain their pre-1939, 1940 borders, there is no way on earth that the United States or Great Britain would have said, yeah, you go ahead. You got that. It's all you. Yeah,
Absolutely
and we'll help
none.
you fight the communists too, please.
And as I said, both Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, partly because they were so determined to make sure that none made a separate peace with Germany. I mean, the Western Allies were petrified that Stalin was going to do this. Stalin was petrified that the Western Allies were going to do this because they were all capitalists together. And really, the motivation behind the Allies was to make sure that Germany was utterly defeated militarily. No resistance group was going to come to Churchill, Roosevelt, or Stalin and say, hey guys, and they tried. I mean, Himmler tried, many of them tried, and it just wasn't going to go anywhere. So there's a very big question mark as to whether or not this had any chance of succeeding whatsoever. I think the really important thing about the resistance, and indeed the movie as well, is to show that there were Germans within the system, and that for whatever motivation, even if it wasn't really that pure driven as the driven snow, that nevertheless there was a sense that people were against Hitler, and that not the entire 100% of the German nation was willing to follow him right to the very bitter end. That there were people who were willing to put their lives on the line to try and stop this maniac.
Yep, and it does get that point across very well. The July plot was obviously a failure, and it did impact much of the high command. Do you think this had an impact on the end of the war in Europe? And I'm going to jump on this, and then y'all follow in. I think it did, and I think it did because of what you talked about just a minute ago, Alex, which was the spike in, I don't want to say popularity, but maybe support of Hitler, and the fact that the fanatical resistance that you see. Not so much against the Soviets, because I think that would have been there regardless, but against the Western Allies as, the British and the Americans move into Germany. And this is, where you got Hitler Youth coming out and shooting at Sherman tanks with Panzerfausts, and, girls and old men fighting in the streets of Aachen and places like that, and obviously later on Berlin. I think that fanatical resistance was only increased because of the attempt on the Führer's life, and everybody. This is just my opinion, but those people felt like they had to prove their loyalty even more. I'd be interested to hear what you guys got to say.
So on the flip side of that too, the loss of a lot of the high command of the Wehrmacht very likely allowed for that fanaticism to be more open, because we've
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
already established that the high command of the Wehrmacht were very conservative, and they often would have been the ones to subdue that fanaticism within their own communities, in their own areas of command. So with them gone, it allows that fanaticism to thrive.
The other thing I was thinking about too was after the plot was revealed and failed, the amount of resources that Germany diverted to like find the conspirators that could have been invested in something else related to the war effort. So kind of stretching Germany even thinner by going in after these people when really in the end they were doomed anyway, and they should have been investing the resources in something else.
Yeah, I don't think I think that was minor. I don't think there was a huge amount of resources, but I think what the real consequence of the plot was that Hitler comes out of it thinking that he has been saved by providence, whatever you want to call it, thinking that, his generals had all been traitors and had let him down, and that somehow he'd been spared by divine providence to lead the German nation to the bitter end. And this increases his fanaticism and cuts him off from the rest of the general staff. And in fact, you see from the beginning, right from the beginning after the plot, that his trust in his own generals goes down the drain, and he starts to take more and more control by himself, which results in many more disastrous decisions. And so I think that's one of the consequences of the plot, which is leads to even more fanaticism on Hitler's part.
Another point is that some 200 officers were executed after this plot, German officers. So you're talking about decapitating a really significant part of the Wehrmacht's command, and at a very pivotal point in the war. I mean, 1944, yes, the war's lost, but to what extent? Germany had not totally lost just yet. They were certainly losing, but and they weren't going to win, but there was still hope, I guess, by this point.
The real key was that Hitler decided that these people were irrelevant anyway. So whether or not some people were arrested, executed or not, it didn't really change. It was not decapitating the armed forces in any real sense of the word. But what the consequences are, so for example, you talk about the Volkssturm, the creation of this People's Army. This is very much Himmler's idea. It starts in October 1944, and the idea is to, and I would actually argue with you as well, is that say this is much more important on the Eastern Front. That the big motivation is to try and create a kind of movement of all Germans, men, women, children, to fight against the onslaught of the Soviet hordes. That some of this happens in the streets of Aachen is a kind of a sideshow. The real motivation that Hitler and Himmler managed to motivate the German people is because of the terrifying images of the Red Army coming toward Berlin, and this is another consequence of the 44 plot, is that the one person who wins out of it aside from Hitler is Himmler. Himmler is given army command for the first time, which he is hopeless at, of course. There's the creation of the Volkssturm and many other consequences of the plot where the Wehrmacht is pushed aside and Hitler pulls out of nowhere almost these really inadequate replacements to try and make up for the fact that he doesn't trust the Wehrmacht at all anymore.
I think the only one that you could say that of the officers that was executed that may have had any kind of impact on the war would have been Erwin Rommel. He might have been the only one, but I mean, the argument could be made that by him being executed, or rather by him committing suicide, but I mean, execution, whatever, however you want to tally it, it actually probably shortened the war a little bit and helped us out quite a bit. But, to add to your point, when the Allies landed in Normandy on the 6th of June, the war was essentially over for Germany. It was just a matter. It's kind of like Midway in the Pacific. Once we won against the Japanese at Midway, or really actually more so even Guadalcanal, it was just a matter of time before we were in Tokyo Bay. And I think the same could be said. It was just a matter of time before we were in Berlin, which obviously the Soviets got there first. But still, moving on from that, And this is something I think is interesting, and we kind of touched on it before, but I think it's important. In the film, we see 2 failed attempts on Hitler's life. Obviously the 20th July plot, and then one that occurs on March 13th, 1943. What other assassination plots are known to have happened, and how many actually got close? I mean, this is the closest one, obviously, July 20th, but how many got, had any real chance of cutting the head off the snake?
I think Essler's the one that really gets close because he puts the bombs in the beer hall,
yeah.
and the one in the beer hall, and it's just because Hitler leaves early that the place is blown up and Hitler would have been killed, no question. Well, there's always a question, but and there were a number of other attempts on his life, but that probably was the one that came the closest.
Mm. I mean, you got to wonder too if it hadn't been so cold. The theory is that the igniters for when you see in the beginning of the movie when von Trachtel's putting the igniters in the British explosives in the Cointreau bottle, that would have done him in too.
Would have done him in too.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's discuss Tom Cruise's portrayal of von Stauffenberg. I know that was a big sticking point with the German people because he is viewed as a German national hero. And I see you, Adam, you're flaring your nostrils.
Yeah.
Let it roll, man. Go for it.
I actually didn't hate how Tom Cruise portrayed von Stauffenberg. He did it in a very solemn way, which I thought was good for someone who is seen as a national hero. On the flip side, it definitely did not portray the Nazis in particularly a bad guy kind of role that we've seen so many times in films, especially American films, trying to portray Nazis as this inherently evil people, and this film didn't really do that, and it actually portrayed them as more human than I was expecting. And watching so many World War II films, you kind of just come to expect this idea of the Nazi being a really terrible person and a really terrible human, and all of their actions are pointing toward that idea. And this film didn't really do that.
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, they weren't monsters in the sense that they came out born different. The whole problem, the whole problematic with the Nazi crimes is that they were ordinary people. This is
right.
What Christopher Browning talks about in Ordinary Men. You get a little police battalion from Hamburg who turns into mass murderers over a course of a few weeks because they buy into the fact that, yes, you actually have to kill Jews, men, women, and children in pits, and thank you very much. And this is I think the dilemma. I think the Hollywood portrayal of Nazis has made it very easy for us because, of course, if they're Nazis in a uniform saluting and saying Heil Hitler, okay, they're baddies, and that's very easy, isn't it?
Right.
The trouble is that they also return to their wives and children in Hamburg or in Dusseldorf or in Munich and put on their fuzzy slippers and had a pipe by the fire and were perfectly nice guys when they got home. And if there's so many memoirs and testimonies that I've read over the course of doing research and showing exactly that. They were good family men. Hitler loved dogs and children. Himmler was a fantastic film about Himmler called the Decent One, which shows his letters and correspondence with his family over the years. Perfectly nice guy. This is Himmler. And that's the challenge to all of us, is that they are just normal human beings who are taken by whatever, the system, the ideology, the leadership, the love of killing for some of them, whatever it is, and they turn into these people. So yes, I think it's absolutely right that they should be portrayed as human beings, because that's our dilemma. That's our moral dilemmas. How do you prevent this from happening, because they are just ordinary people who make these decisions to kill or to murder.
Yeah, and that portrayal made this the way that was portrayed is what made this really more interesting, because we have gotten so used, and we've said it here a dozen times on this very podcast, that that trope of just the evil Nazi doing this and the evil Nazi doing that has so it was just a really interesting way to see how it was portrayed from a more human and from a more personal perspective. than the bigger picture evil idea.
Yeah, and I think another strength of the film is showing von Stauffenberg with his family, and them when Berlin is being bombed and them taking shelter, and then hearing the Valkyrie theme over it. Again, all the symbolism is nice, I suppose, but another way of humanizing someone who, again, is the hero, but to show that, again, this idea of regular people doing regular things.
And as for how Tom Cruise portrays Stauffenberg, I think he was great. I mean, he looks like him. Stauffenberg was a very handsome guy. In terms of the way that he portrays him just simply physically was, I think, a fantastic choice. And the only sort of conflict from the German side was the fact that he's a Scientologist, and so there was a lot of controversy in Germany because the German government considered Scientologists to be kind of a cult, so they were a bit worried. But I think once they saw the film, people were very pleased by the way in which he actually portrayed this man.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, I will say though, I'm going to bring it up. The one thing about the portrayal about everybody we talked about beforehand, but is the American and British accents playing German. So I feel like I got to bring it up once, So, but we'd rather have that than Americans and British doing bad German accents. But I think the solution there is to cast German actors.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Eddie Izzard did an awesome job as the communications general, and I thought that just the fear in his eyes and just knowing that he was participating was, I thought the acting was actually pretty good throughout most of the film. But to go back to Chrissy's point just for a second, as seeing von Stauffenberg as a family man, that's really evident whenever he realizes that the plot fails, and he keeps telling his secretary, "Hey, have you found my wife? Have you called my wife? Have you?" And he, in his head, he knows that this has failed, and he just wanted to talk to her one more time.
It's a really sad moment.
And I don't know how accurate that is, but it's
it is, and a number of the families went through the same thing because, of course, the wives and children were supposed to be arrested, and the children taken away from the families, and they were put into special homes, and some of them adopted out to SS families and so on, and their identities erased. And there's a very powerful film that came out last year about the relationship between Freya von Moltke and Helmut James von Moltke in prison. And then their letters, his letters to her from prison, and so on. This was representative of many of these families who were ripped to pieces because of this plot. And von Moltke, for example, was innocent of involvement in this particular plot, and yet they were all implicated because they knew each other. They were on lists that shouldn't have been found, and so on. They weren't, using tradecraft, as it were. And then many of them were arrested, and then they were interrogated, and other people were arrested, and so on, so that you, as you said, had, at the end, hundreds and hundreds of people who were implicated and arrested and hung on piano wire in Plötzensee prison for even tentative involvement in this plot.
No, I think Tom Cruise did. I'm not a huge fan of the man myself. I'm not a huge fan of his acting. However, that being said, I think, and everybody said that here, and I'm just going to reiterate what everybody said. It seems like he took great care in portraying this guy. And, he learned how to manipulate things with his left hand because, von Stauffenberg did. And it was very evident, I think, that he was very careful in what he did, and he was very cognizant of the fact that this guy was an important figure in history, and he is somebody that's held dear by the Germans. And I'm sure he was not unaware of the fact that they did not want him to play that role. So I think that probably, I'm just guessing here, that probably influenced his behavior even more. But I think he did a great job. And I forget who here at the table said it. He looks just like him.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, he looks just like von, at least from the side, he looks just like him. And, you talk about him being a family man. He was a devout Catholic. That much I know. He was a devout Roman Catholic. And he had 4 or 5 children. I forget how many.
I think his wife was pregnant at the time of the coup, right?
She was.
The last child was born after.
Yeah, I know that he had twins.
Yeah, he had several children. So I think the portrayal of him in the film being concern for his family. That I would say that's probably pretty dang accurate. He was, and you get the impression throughout the movie that that was part. I mean, the oath was part of the reason that he was kind of wishy-washy, but it was also because he was no fool. He knew that if this plot failed, and if he was implicated in that plot, his family was going to receive, a hard time, shall we say? And I think that certainly came through in the movie. And I have no doubt that played a part in his decision making, or contemplating whether or not he was going to participate in it, because he knew what would happen to his family. And in that regard, I think the movie does a really good job, and I think Tom Cruise did a fantastic job, and I really do.
Yeah, at one point the character even says, whenever the general who ordered the home guard to stand by the older, I don't know his name, but
Ulbricht.
Yeah, Ulbricht. Whenever he doesn't order the home guard to take over Berlin in the 3 hours that von Stauffenberg is on the plane, whenever von Stauffenberg shows up, he actually says, "Hey, I've already done this. If this fails, we're all going to die anyway." And he actually says that in the film. So you're right, Seth, that he knew that he was putting his life on the line there.
So let's start wrapping this up. Alex, I'm going to start with you. Did you like the film, and would you recommend this movie?
I like the film. I would recommend the movie. I know a lot of the resistance families, and despite the fact that there were quibbles and problems with one thing or another, they actually all say that the film was very helpful to them, because they're trying to keep the memory of the resistors alive. And of course, as memory of World War II fades, this is one of the things that's fading with it. And they were very pleased that despite controversies and criticisms, that the film was by and large accurate, even down to things like uniforms and using real tanks and so on in the movie. That Stauffenberg was well portrayed by Tom Cruise. That they showed the fear and the desperation of trying to get to Hitler, of the chaos that ensues when Hitler doesn't die, and the consequences of that for all of those involved in the plot, even those not involved and then later implicated in the plot. So the families themselves are very much for the film, and I think that for me pretty well says it all.
Yeah, agreed. Adam?
So I'm actually going to echo exactly what Dr. Richie just said. There's all too often that we sit around the table on this podcast and we say, it was a good film for entertainment, but don't really, you won't learn history from it. This one I'm not going to say that about. I actually think that it's accurate enough to get a really detailed understanding of the events that happened surrounding the July plot. So I actually really like this film. It was only my second or third time watching it. So I actually really enjoyed this film. And then I watched several documentaries after this one just to see what they were all saying. And it seems relatively accurate. So you'll actually learn history from this film, which we don't say very often.
Chrissy?
I liked it. It wasn't my, obviously, favorite movie on World War II, but I would recommend it because I think it does a really good job showing that chaos, as Alex mentioned. There's so many rich visuals in there of that moment of what do we do and who do we follow. And I'll just bring up one in this short time of that when they're in the communication center and there's all these conflicting messages coming in from the Wolfschanze and then from Stauffenberg's headquarters, and which one do you take? Which one do you follow through on? Those are the best moments of the film, and that's why I really, really enjoyed it overall.
Just one final note is that on my Rise and Fall of Hitler's Germany tour, we go to the Wolfschanze, and on our way there, I always show the film Valkyrie, because I think that the depiction of the checkpoints, you mentioned it earlier, there are 3 layers before you can even get near Hitler. And then getting in and seeing to this day the bunkers that still exist there with 7 meters of concrete above where Hitler was going. We go to where the hut exploded, where Hitler survived. And you follow the route of where Stauffenberg has to get out past the guard post to be able to flee, get to the airfield and so on. It's very dramatic, and it's very dramatic going to the site and understanding how horrible this place was, how kind of dense and despicable a world Hitler actually lived in, both mentally and physically, in the Wolfschanze. And so as we drive in, we're just finishing Valkyrie, and it just is absolutely perfect in that sense.
Well, I don't think you can beat that that recommendation. But I went and saw this movie about a week after it came out, and because I think it came out on Christmas Day here, if I remember correctly. So it was about a week, 10 days or something like that after it. And I liked it when I saw it in the theater. And when it came out on DVD, I bought the DVD, and I watched it when I bought the DVD, and then I watched it again last night because I hadn't seen it in, I don't know, 5-6 years or whatever it was. And it was good the first time, the second time, and the third time. I think it's a good movie. And the fact that you already know what happens, you know what's going to happen.
That's very true.
And you still
like it.
Feel, there's certain instances in the movie where you're kind of like, ooh, what's going to happen? I think that's a pretty good indication that it's a well-done film. And the fact that it is very accurate, we've talked about that ad nauseum here, that, I would highly recommend this movie. It's good. It's well done. The acting in it is fantastic. It looks good. It sounds good. It's just a really good flick. I would definitely highly, highly recommend it. Alex, can you give us some final thoughts? Can you sum it up?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think it's worth watching, and I think that it really depicts this struggle, moral struggle of people who were honorable Germans, knowing that they were about to commit murder. And you're absolutely right, too, that although it's a Hollywood film, and very much a Hollywood big-budget film, it doesn't have a happy ending. And this is something I think that highly commends it, because usually you expect everybody to skip off into the sunlight and everything works out really well. And this doesn't happen in this film, and I think that's something to recommend it very, very highly, that it tells the story, and the tragedy of the ending is exactly what happened.
Adam?
So this film gives an unusually human story in a typical sea of chaos, I guess you can say. It really brings the humanity into decision making that we often don't see in other World War II films. So,
Chrissy?
Yeah, I would say also this film, more than other ones I even have done on this podcast, is that I wanted to research more. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to learn more about the conspirators. I wanted to learn and just think about more about this. Even challenging my own ideas about Germany and collective guilt. And the film really challenged me in a way that I wasn't expecting. So yeah, as I said, I would recommend it for that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fantastic movie that talks about a piece of history that people, at least in this country, kind of know about, but they have no real idea of the detail, and they have probably no real idea or respect for the lengths in which these people put themselves to try and get this specific situation to completion, and that, of course, is the elimination and the eradication of Adolf Hitler. So with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, tune in to our mini episode next week. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.